"You're hurting me," she moaned. The cowboy whispered, "It's the only force I know." The morning sun rose slowly over the wide open plains, casting golden light across the dusty town of Red Willow. It was a kind of town that seemed frozen in time, with weathered wooden buildings, creaking porches, and the low hum of life that belonged more to the land than to people. Clara had lived here all her life. The ranch she called home had been in her family for generations, and every inch of it carried memories of laughter, hard work, and long, quiet nights under the stars. Today, though, Clara felt the weight of worry pressing on her shoulders more than ever. The past few seasons had been hard. Droughts had withered the fields, and the cattle had grown thin. Her father, once a strong and lively man, had fallen ill the year before, leaving Clara to shoulder the responsibilities of the ranch at just 23. She had spent countless hours tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and negotiating with suppliers in town. Yet somehow, the ranch still seemed to slip further out of her control. Her hands bore the calluses of relentless labor, and her back ached from bending over stubborn soil that refused to yield. On this particular morning, Clara had risen before dawn, as was her habit. She moved quietly through the small farmhouse, careful not to wake her younger brother, who still slept in the room at the far end of the house. Breakfast was simple: oatmeal, a slice of bread, and strong coffee, but it gave her the energy she needed for the work ahead. Today she planned to check the fences along the northern pasture. A section near the creek had been damaged by last night's storm, and if it went unrepaired, the cattle might wander into the neighbor's land. Clara swung open the creaking barn door and inhaled the familiar scent of hay, earth, and leather. The animals were calm, milling about as she moved among them, feeding them and making sure they were safe. She worked quickly but carefully, her mind already racing with tasks for the day. Just as she tied the last bundle of hay, she noticed a movement in the distance. Near the edge of the pasture, a lone figure was guiding a horse along the trail that led from the hills into town. At first, Clara thought it might be one of the neighboring ranchers, but as the man drew closer, she saw that he was unlike anyone she had met before. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded most of his face, a weathered leather coat, and boots that had clearly seen years of travel. The horse he rode was strong, muscular, and clearly spirited, yet he seemed to handle it with an ease that spoke of deep experience. Curiosity stirred within Clara. She had heard stories of cowboys who wandered from town to town, men who had learned to live with the land and the animals in a way that few others could. But she had never met one herself. And something about this man, his quiet confidence, the way he seemed to move as if he belonged to the landscape, made her heart quicken with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The cowboy rode closer and slowed as he approached the barn. He tipped his hat slightly, revealing a weathered face with lines carved by sun and wind, and eyes that seemed both sharp and thoughtful. "Morning," he said in a low, steady voice. "Name's Jed. I'm looking for work. Thought I'd see if a place like this might need a hand." Clara straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. She was used to dealing with strangers in town, but something about Jed's presence felt different, honest and unpretentious. "I'm Clara," she replied cautiously. "We might need help with the cattle and the fences. It's been a tough season." Jed nodded, his eyes scanning the pasture. "Looks like it," he said simply. "I can handle a horse, mend fences, round up cattle, whatever needs doing." Clara hesitated. Hiring someone was a big decision, especially someone she barely knew. But the truth was plain. She needed help. The ranch had grown too large for her to manage alone, and the workload was taking a toll on her health and energy. Still, there was a part of her that was wary. "We don't have much to offer," she said honestly. "And I'll be frank, I don't usually take on strangers, especially cowboys passing through." Jed's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I get it," he said. "I've been around enough ranches to know how it goes. If you don't want me, I'll move along. But I can promise you, I work hard, and I know my way around a ranch." Clara studied him for a moment. She could see the truth in his eyes. There was no pretense, no charm meant to win favor. This man had spent his life working with horses, cattle, and the unforgiving land. He was the real deal. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "You can start with the northern pasture, fence repair first thing. But don't expect it to be easy. Those fences are old, and the land is rough." Jed tipped his hat again. "I like rough," he said simply. Over the next few hours, Clara watched as Jed moved through the pasture with a skill and confidence she had never seen. He climbed over the damaged fence with ease, guided the horses back into the enclosure without a single misstep, and repaired the broken boards with speed and precision. Clara felt a mix of relief and admiration. This man's methods were direct, almost forceful at times, but there was a purpose behind every movement. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, heat rising from the dry earth, Clara couldn't help but notice how different Jed's presence felt compared to the townsfolk she was used to. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured and calm. There was a sense of quiet strength about him, a kind of force that was not about aggression, but about control and understanding. By midday, the fence was mended, and the cattle were safe. Jed wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced toward Clara. "That should hold them for now," he said. "You've got a strong herd, but you'll need to keep an eye on them. The creek area's tricky after a storm." Clara nodded, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. There was something about Jed that unsettled her slightly. Perhaps it was the intensity in his gaze, or the way he seemed completely at home in a world that often felt overwhelming to her. Yet she also knew she couldn't deny the fact that he had made the impossible seem possible. "You make it look easy?" she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Jed shook his head. "It's not easy," he said. "You just get used to it. Force isn't always what it seems. Sometimes it's all you've got."
Clara frowned. Curious? What do you mean?
Jed shrugged. "Life out here, it doesn't wait for anyone. You either act or you get left behind. The only force I know is the one that keeps things moving, keeps people safe, keeps the land alive." Clara looked at him, trying to understand. There was a depth to his words, a weight that suggested experience, hardship, and lessons learned over years that she could only imagine. She realized for the first time that this was more than just a man who could mend fences and ride horses. He was someone who had lived through struggles, and who carried the mark of those struggles in everything he did. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Clara and Jed continued their work in companionable silence. The tasks themselves were simple, but the shared effort created a connection neither had expected. There were no grand gestures or dramatic conversations, only the quiet rhythm of two people working side by side, learning to trust one another through action rather than words. By the time they finished, Clara felt a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in months. The ranch was safer, the fences secure, and the cattle settled for the night. But more than that, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps, with help, the impossible could be managed. Jed mounted his horse, ready to ride to the next task she had assigned him. He looked down at Clara, tipping his hat once more. "We'll get through this," he said simply. "It won't be easy, but it can be done." Clara watched him ride toward the hills, a strange mix of admiration and wariness in her heart. She didn't know much about this man, but she had a feeling that their paths were meant to cross. And somehow, she knew that the lessons he carried, the force, the skill, the determination, would shape not only the ranch's future, but her own, in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the sun set over Red Willow, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Clara returned to the farmhouse. She paused on the porch, looking out over the land she loved so fiercely. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face it all alone. The next morning, the ranch was alive with activity. Birds called to one another from the treetops, and the low murmur of cattle drifted across the fields. Clara was already outside before sunrise, checking the water troughs and making sure the animals had enough food. She had barely finished her early chores when she noticed Jed approaching, the dust of the trail rising behind him. He had spent the night in town resting and had returned ready to continue the work they had started the day before. "Morning," he said quietly, tipping his hat. There was no need for grand greetings. Both had settled into an unspoken rhythm of work. Clara nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "We need to check the east pasture today. The fence there is old, and one of the posts looked weak last night." Jed glanced over at the pasture, his eyes scanning the line of weathered wood stretching toward the hills.
I'll take care of it.
"You want me to round up the cattle first?"
"Yes," Clara said. "They've been restless this morning."
"I think they can sense the wind shifting. They'll try to wander if we don't keep an eye on them." Jed moved with a calm efficiency that Clara couldn't help but admire. He approached the cattle slowly, speaking in low tones that seemed almost musical in their gentleness. One by one, the animals responded to his voice and the subtle movements of his body. Clara watched, fascinated, as he guided them into a temporary enclosure. There was no shouting or panic, just steady control. "You really know them," she said quietly, almost to herself. Jed glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "They know me too," he said simply. "It's all about trust. You can't force a creature to obey, you earn it." Clara felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the cattle were now secure. Frustration because she had spent years trying to do the same thing with little success. She realized that Jed's methods, though simple in appearance, were built on years of experience and a deep understanding of the land and animals. Once the cattle were settled, they moved to the fence. Clara carried the tools while Jed assessed the posts, running his hands along the weathered wood as if he could feel its history. "This one's rotten," he said, pointing to a post near the edge of the pasture. "It won't hold in a storm. We'll need to replace it." Clara sighed. "I thought we could just reinforce it." She hated the thought of spending the day digging and hammering, but she knew he was right. Jed smiled faintly. "Sometimes you have to start fresh. Otherwise, you're just putting a bandage on a wound that keeps reopening." The two of them worked side by side, hammering, lifting, and digging in the hot sun. Sweat ran down their faces, and the earth seemed to cling to every inch of their skin. Yet despite the hard work, Clara couldn't shake a growing unease. There was something in Jed's demeanor that unsettled her. He was calm, almost detached, but at times his methods seemed harsh. He didn't hesitate to use his strength when moving heavy posts, and occasionally his instructions were curt and commanding. "You need to push harder," he said as Clara tried to lift a post that was stuck in the ground. "You'll get nowhere if you don't use all your strength." Clara gritted her teeth, feeling the muscles in her arms protest. "I'm trying," she said, though her voice carried a hint of frustration. Jed didn't respond immediately. Instead, he bent down and guided her hands, showing her the right angle and the leverage needed. "Here," he said softly. "Use your weight, not just your arms. Let the force work for you." Clara followed his instructions, and with a final push, the post gave way. She stumbled back, exhausted but triumphant. Jed nodded, as if satisfied. "See, force isn't always about being rough. It's about knowing how to use it." As the day went on, the sun climbed higher, and the temperature soared. They paused only for a brief lunch under the shade of an old oak tree. Clara pulled out a small loaf of bread and some cheese, offering some to Jed, who accepted with a quiet nod. They ate in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the grass and the occasional lowing of cattle. Clara found herself stealing glances at him. He was a man of contradictions, strong yet gentle, quiet yet commanding, distant yet attentive. She wondered about his past, what had shaped him into someone so skilled, so unflinching in the face of hard work. "You've spent a lot of time out here alone," she said cautiously. "I imagine it's not an easy life." Jed looked up from his bread, eyes thoughtful. "It's not easy," he admitted, "but it's honest. You learn to depend on yourself and respect the land. That's all anyone can ask for." Clara nodded, sensing the truth in his words. She had spent years trying to keep the ranch alive, and she understood the weight of responsibility he spoke of. Yet, there was something in his tone, a quiet acceptance of hardship, that both comforted and unnerved her. After lunch, they returned to the fence. The work continued, and as they labored, Clara began to notice small details. how Jed moved with the land rather than against it, how he anticipated the way the cattle would react, how his instructions, though sometimes sharp, were always precise and effective. She realized that his forcefulness wasn't cruelty, it was a skill, honed over years of living with the land and animals. Still, there were moments when his intensity overwhelmed her. At one point, a stubborn post refused to budge, and Jed's patience snapped for a brief second. "Listen to me," he said firmly, guiding her hands again. "If you don't push, it won't move. You've got to commit." Clara felt a sting of frustration. She was tired, her arms ached, and the sun had burned her skin. "I'm trying," she said, her voice rising slightly. Jed paused, his expression softening. "I know you are," he said quietly. Force isn't about hurting someone. It's about helping them find strength they didn't know they had. His words struck her, and she realized that he was teaching her not just about the ranch, but about herself. The strength she thought she lacked was there. It just needed guidance, patience, and the right push. By late afternoon, the fence was finally repaired. The posts were secure, the rails strong, and the cattle safe once more. Clara leaned against a post, breathing heavily, her hands blistered and her body sore. Yet despite the exhaustion, she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in months. Jed approached her, wiping sweat from his brow. "You did well," he said simply. "You have the strength. It was always there. You just needed to see it." Clara smiled, a mix of pride and relief washing over her. "I guess I needed the push," she admitted. Jed nodded, tipping his hat. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs. A little guidance, a little force, and suddenly things you thought were impossible become possible." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Clara felt a strange sense of calm. The work had been hard, the day exhausting, but she had learned something valuable, not just about the land or the cattle, but about herself and the people she trusted to help her. That evening, after the animals were fed and the chores complete, Clara sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. Jed worked quietly in the barn, repairing tools and preparing for the next day. There was a rhythm to life on the ranch that was both harsh and comforting, a reminder that the world was demanding, but that with effort, skill, and trust, it could also be rewarding. Clara realized that Jed's presence, though sometimes unsettling, had brought a new energy to the ranch. He was more than a helper. He was a teacher, a guide, and perhaps even a friend. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. As night fell and the stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, Clara thought about the lessons of the day. Force, she realized, was not always about strength. It was about understanding, direction, and care. Jed had shown her that. And for the first time in months, she felt ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing she was not alone. The days passed quickly on the ranch, each one blending into the next with the rhythm of hard work and quiet determination. Clara found herself settling into a routine she hadn't known she could manage alone. With Jed's help, the ranch began to feel alive again. Fences were repaired, the pastures healthier, and the cattle calmer. Yet, there was more to the man than his skill with animals or fences. Clara sensed a depth to Jed, a story hidden behind his quiet demeanor, and she found herself curious, even cautious, about what lay beneath. One morning the sky was heavy with gray clouds promising rain. Clara had just begun checking the water troughs when she heard the distant rumble of thunder. She frowned, glancing at the fields. The cattle were restless, pawing the earth nervously. Jed appeared shortly after, moving along the path with calm, purposeful strides. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice low and steady. "We'll need to get the cattle closer to the barn. They don't like lightning." Clara nodded, already gathering the gates to guide the herd. She had done it many times before, but today she realized how much easier it was with Jed beside her. He didn't take over, but he moved beside her, guiding her hand, suggesting subtle shifts in position, and keeping a watchful eye on the animals. As they worked, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by the roar of thunder. Clara jumped, startled, but Jed's presence was steady, unshaken by the storm. "Easy," he said calmly, placing a hand on the fence. "They'll follow your lead. Stay calm, and they'll stay calm too." She noticed, as she often did, how his forcefulness was tempered with patience. He pushed her when she needed direction, but never overpowered her. He guided rather than commanded, teaching her to trust both herself and him. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets, soaking their clothes and plastering Clara's hair to her face. The ground turned to mud, making every step more difficult. Yet, even in the downpour, Jed moved with ease, navigating the slippery field while keeping the cattle under control. Clara struggled beside him, slipping and sliding, but he remained patient. "You got this," he said, steadying a stubborn cow with a gentle nudge. "Use your weight, not just your arms. Move with them, not against them." Clara followed his instructions, and slowly the herd made its way toward the barn. She realized that the lessons he had been teaching all along were not just about ranch work. They were about life. Force, he had shown her, was not about domination or harshness. It was about understanding, timing, and knowing when to act. By the time the last of the cattle were safe, both of them were drenched and covered in mud. Clara leaned against the barn door, breathing heavily. He looked at Jed, who was brushing rainwater from his coat, and felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jed nodded, offering a small smile. "You did most of it." "I just guided you." "You guided me, yes, but you taught me something too. I couldn't have done it alone." Jed's gaze softened, and for a moment, the harsh lines of his face seemed less imposing. "Sometimes, we all need someone to guide us," he said. "Doesn't mean we're weak, just means we're learning." That evening, after the storm had passed, Clara found herself sitting by the fire in the farmhouse, drying her hair and warming her hands. The smell of rain on the earth mixed with the aroma of the cooking stew, and she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known for months. Jed was nearby, quietly repairing tools and tending to the animals that needed attention. Clara found herself watching him, noticing the way his hands moved with precision, the careful way he handled each object. She realized that every action he took was deliberate, shaped by experience and respect for the land. She wondered how many years he had spent learning, struggling, and surviving in a world that demanded resilience at every turn. Over the next few days, Clara and Jed continued to work side by side. The tasks were not easy, but the partnership between them grew stronger. They shared moments of frustration when fences broke or cattle wandered. But they also shared laughter and small victories. Clara began to feel a bond forming, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. One afternoon, while they were repairing a particularly stubborn section of the northern fence, Clara noticed Jed's hands were calloused and scarred. She hesitated before speaking, curious about the man behind the rugged exterior. "Jed," she said carefully, "have you always worked on ranches?" Jed paused, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "Most of my life," he said finally. "Started when I was young. Learned by watching, by doing, and by making mistakes." "A lot of mistakes." Clara nodded, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "It must be hard," she said softly, "being out here, alone, so often." Jed shrugged, his gaze returning to the fence. "It's not easy, no, but it teaches you things. About the land, about animals, about yourself. You learn to rely on what you know, and sometimes what you don't." Clara considered his words, realizing they applied to more than just ranch work. He thought of the challenges she had faced running the family ranch, the moments when she had felt overwhelmed and uncertain. Perhaps, she realized, Jed's forcefulness wasn't just a method, it was a way of coping with life's difficulties, a skill born of necessity. Over the next few weeks, Clara found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She shared stories of her childhood on the ranch, of her father's illness, and of the fears she carried about the future. Jed listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. His presence was steady, grounding, and for the first time, Clara felt that she could trust someone completely. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they worked together to mend a section of fence that had been damaged by wind. Clara struggled with a particularly heavy post, her arms shaking with effort. Jed stepped closer, placing his hands over hers. "Use your weight, not just your arms," he reminded her gently. "Lean into it." Clara followed his guidance and the post moved into place. She stepped back, wiping sweat and dirt from her brow, and looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "I don't know how you made it look so easy," she said, laughing softly. Jed shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not easy," he said. "You just get used to it. And you learn to see what needs to be done before it becomes a problem." As they worked together, Clara realized that the lessons Jed was teaching her were not just about strength or skill. They were about trust, patience, and understanding. She had learned to rely on herself, yes, but she had also learned to rely on someone else. And in that reliance, she found a sense of connection and hope she hadn't felt in a long time. One rainy afternoon, as they sheltered under the barn from a sudden downpour, Clara looked at Jed with curiosity. "You've lived a hard life," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." Jed paused, his gaze distant for a moment. "We all have our struggles," he said finally. "Mine just taught me the only way I knew to survive. Sometimes force is all you have, and sometimes it's the only way to protect what matters." Clara considered his words, feeling the weight behind them. She understood now that his rough exterior was not cruelty. It was experience, discipline, and care in the only form he had learned. She felt a new respect for him, not just as a helper, but as a person who had faced the challenges of life and survived. Over the following days, the bond between them deepened further. They shared small moments of quiet conversation, laughter during difficult tasks, and a mutual understanding that did not require constant words. Clara began to see that Jed's methods, though sometimes intense, were guided by experience and care. His force was not about harm. It was about survival, guidance, and protection. One evening, after a long day repairing fences and checking the cattle, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the scent of rain on the earth. Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. "Jed," she said softly, "I think I understand now. The force you use, it's not just about work. It's about life." Jed looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. "Exactly," he said. "It's all I know. But I hope it can teach someone else too. That strength isn't just about power. It's about knowing what to do, when, and how." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude and connection that went beyond words. She realized that through their shared work and trust, she had learned not only the skills needed to run the ranch, but also lessons about resilience, patience, and understanding. As the stars appeared in the clear night sky, Clara felt a quiet hope for the future. With Jed's guidance, the ranch had begun to thrive again, but more importantly, she had begun to thrive as well. She had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed, and she had found someone she could rely on, a partner, a guide, and a friend. In the quiet of the night, as the ranch settled into stillness, Clara knew that life would still bring challenges. But with Jed by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Their bond, forged through shared struggle and understanding, had transformed both of them, and the lessons of force, patience, and care would remain with her always. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth from last night's rain. The ranch seemed to breathe with life once more. Grass glistened with dew, and the cattle moved slowly across the pastures, their coats shining under the sun. Clara stepped onto the porch, stretching her tired muscles, and looked over the land she had worked so hard to protect. She could hardly believe how much had changed in just a few weeks. The fences were strong, the fields had begun to recover, and the cattle were calm and healthy. Most importantly, she had begun to trust herself and the quiet man who had walked into her life. Jed was already at work in the barn, checking the horses and preparing supplies for the day. Clara watched him for a moment, noticing the way he moved with purpose, his every action deliberate and careful. She realized that she had come to rely on his presence not because she was weak, but because together they were stronger. "Morning," Jed called, glancing up and giving a small nod.
"Morning," Clara replied, smiling. "We've got a full day ahead."
"I want to check the southern fence line and see if any of the posts need reinforcement." "Let's get to it. I'll help you with the heavier posts." The day began with steady work. Clara and Jed moved along the fence line, examining each post, repairing what was broken, and replacing what was too old to hold. As they worked, Clara noticed how much she had learned from him. She handled the tools more confidently now, anticipating the way the fence needed to be repaired, and even guiding Jed's actions at times. There was a partnership between them now, one built on respect, trust, and shared effort. "You've gotten faster," Jed observed, handing her a hammer. "You handle the posts like you've been doing this for years." Clara laughed softly, wiping sweat from her brow. "I suppose I have, when you've got a teacher who knows what he's doing." Jed's eyes softened slightly. "You don't give yourself enough credit," he said. "You've always had the strength. You just needed someone to show you the way." They continued their work, moving from post to post. Occasionally, a stubborn section of fence would resist their efforts, forcing them to think carefully and coordinate their movements. Clara realized that what she had learned went beyond fence repair. It was about patience, problem-solving, and trust. She had learned to rely on her own strength, but also to lean on someone she trusted when needed. As midday approached, the sun climbed high in the sky, and heat radiated off the dry earth. They paused under the shade of a tree, drinking water and catching their breath. Clara looked at Jed, noticing the way he shaded his eyes from the sun and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Do you ever get tired of this work?" she asked. Jed shook his head. "Tired? Sometimes, but it's honest work. It keeps me moving, thinking, and alive. And besides," he added with a small smile, "I get to see the results. You fix a fence, care for the cattle, and suddenly the ranch feels alive again. That's worth it." Clara nodded, feeling the truth in his words. She had spent so long struggling alone that she had forgotten what it felt like to work with someone who understood the land, the animals, and the effort required to keep them alive. She realized now that Jed's presence had transformed the ranch, not just physically, but emotionally. The land felt safer, more secure, and she felt stronger and more confident. After lunch, they returned to the southern fence line. A sudden movement caught Clara's eye. A calf had slipped through a weak section of the fence. She rushed forward, but Jed was already there, guiding the animal back with calm efficiency. Clara followed his lead, helping him herd the calf back to the main pen. The experience reminded her of how much she had learned from him, and how much she trusted his judgment. "You've got a good eye," Jed said as they secured the calf. "You see things before they become problems." "That's a skill most people don't have." Clara smiled, feeling proud. "I suppose I've been learning from the best," she said. The afternoon passed with steady work, and by evening the fence was complete. Every post was secure, every rail in place, and the southern pasture was safe once more. Clara stepped back, surveying their work. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, one that went beyond physical labor. She had accomplished something that had seemed impossible weeks before, and she had done it with a partner she now deeply respected. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jed and Clara sat on the porch watching the land they had worked so hard to protect. The ranch was quiet now. The cattle settled for the night, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the fading light. "I never thought I'd see the ranch look like this again," Clara said softly. "It feels alive."
Jed nodded. "It's the work, and it's the care you put into it."
"That's what makes the difference." "And you? You've done more than I could have expected. You're stronger than you think." Clara felt a warmth in her chest at his words. She had always doubted herself, always worried that she wasn't capable enough to manage the ranch alone. But now she realized that she had grown, not just in strength but in confidence, understanding, and trust. Jed had taught her that strength was not just physical, it was patience, skill, and the courage to keep going even when the world seemed against you. As night fell, the two of them worked together one last time, securing the barn and checking on the animals. Clara noticed that Jed moved with the same careful precision he had always shown. But there was a quiet satisfaction in his movements now, a sense of accomplishment and peace. She realized that he, too, had changed. The force he had relied on all his life had been tempered by understanding, patience, and connection. He had taught her about life, and in return, she had shown him that trust and companionship could bring balance to even the hardest life. Once the chores were complete, they returned to the farmhouse, tired but satisfied. Clara prepared a simple dinner, and they ate in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the night settling around them. For the first time in months, Clara felt a sense of contentment she had thought was impossible. The ranch was thriving, the animals were safe, and she had found someone she could rely on, not just for work, but for guidance, understanding, and friendship. After dinner, they sat together by the fire. The flames danced, casting warm light across their faces. Clara looked at Jed, noticing the calm strength in his eyes. "You've taught me a lot," she said softly. "Not just about ranch work, but about life and about myself." "We all teach each other something," he said. "You've taught me too." That force isn't everything. Sometimes patience and trust matter just as much. Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come to the ranch feeling overwhelmed, alone, and unsure of her abilities. Now she felt capable, confident, and connected, to the land, to the animals, and to Jed. She realized that the lessons of the past weeks would stay with her forever. That strength could be gentle, that trust could be earned, and that understanding could transform even the most difficult challenges. The days that followed were filled with steady work and quiet moments of reflection. Clara and Jed continued to repair fences, tend to the cattle, and care for the land. Each day brought new challenges, but they faced them together, their bond growing stronger with every shared task. Clara found herself smiling more often, laughing at small mishaps, and appreciating the simple pleasures of ranch life. The warmth of the sun, the smell of fresh earth, the low murmur of the cattle. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they stood together at the edge of the pasture, surveying the land they had worked so hard to protect. Clara felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. "We've done it," she said softly. "The ranch is safe, the cattle are cared for, and I feel ready for whatever comes next." Jed nodded, his gaze sweeping across the fields. "We've done it together," he said, "and you'll keep doing it. You've grown stronger than you realize, Clara. The land, the animals, and you. You're all ready for the future." Clara smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart. She realized that the journey had changed her in ways she could never have imagined. She had learned about strength, patience, trust, and understanding. She had discovered a partner who guided her, challenged her, and respected her. And she had learned that the force Jed had relied on all his life could be balanced with compassion, care, and connection. As the night settled over the ranch, the stars twinkling in the clear sky, Clara felt a quiet hope for the future. She knew there would still be challenges, storms, and hard work ahead. But she also knew that she was no longer alone. Together, she and Jed had faced the trials of the ranch, learned from one another, and grown stronger. And that, she realized, was the greatest reward of all. The ranch was alive once more, but more importantly, so was Clara's spirit. She had faced the struggles of life, learned to trust, and discovered the power of guidance, patience, and understanding. And in Jed she had found a friend, a teacher, and a companion who would walk beside her through whatever the future held. As they finally settled for the night, the soft sounds of the ranch around them, Clara closed her eyes with a sense of peace. The land was safe, the animals cared for, and the lessons of the past weeks had transformed not only the ranch, but her own heart. The force that Jed had relied on all his life had been tempered by trust, patience, and understanding. And together, they had created something stronger, steadier, and more enduring than either could have achieved alone.